It's all right.
We are live.
All right, we are reconvening our morning meeting and we will Jane Lazorchak from the office.
Thank you, Chair Sheldon. Thank you all for having me this morning. I'm here prepared to give you an overview of the Climate Action Office and the responsibilities that lie within. Have about a half an hour's worth of testimony, but plan for questions and I'm more than happy to take them along the way as you all have them. So go ahead and share my screen. So for the record, Jane Lazorchak, I work in the Secretary's Office of the Agency of Natural Resources and lead the Climate Action Office. The Climate Action Office is a relatively new office within the Agency of Natural Resources. It was stood up with the support of the governor and the legislature in the fiscal year 23 budget. So we're coming on our end of our third year in existence. We sit within the Agency of Natural Resources, not because our responsibilities lie within the agency alone. We really have an external facing role and responsibility around coordinating and amplifying the good work of climate action across all the state agencies involved. But because our office and our agency specifically has some unique requirements associated with the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2020, it made sense for the office to both manage that work, coordinate and amplify it, but also take on those responsibilities that lie to the agency. And so we, as we were contemplating where the office made the most sense, we looked at the Agency of Natural Resources in concert with the governor. We are supported though by an interagency advisory board. It's not dissimilar when the legislature passed the environmental justice law. There was the foresight, intuition to put forward both an EJ advisory council around EJ policy and the requirements of the EJ law, but there was also an interagency body stood up within state government to move those forward. The Global Warming Solutions Act put forward the Climate Council, which advises on climate policy for the state, as well as has the responsibilities to develop the climate action plan for the state. But there was no interagency advisory board stood up. And so that was one of the first actions as our office was stood up in July of 2023. The agencies comprised of the board are commissioners or secretary level or their delegates from the Public Service Department, the Agency of Transportation, Agency of Natural Resources, Emergency Management, the Ag Agency, Buildings and General Services. Agency of Human Services is represented both by the Department of Children and Families and the Vermont Department of Health. Agency of Commerce and Community Development, the Department of Labor, and the state climatologist all sit on the Interagency Advisory Board. We meet at a minimum with this board quarterly, but they're really a space for us to work to provide proactive coordination on climate action across state government, work to articulate policy and financial coordination, support the monitoring of state progress around climate action, and identify and frame up gaps where the Climate Action Office, having unique capacity, might be able to fill in and support agencies beyond our own. And we work in some minimal effort to work to support secretaries and others in developing state positions on issues related to climate change. So I bring this up in large part because I'm going to sort of hone in on the work of our office, but want to be clear and clear-eyed that we're really working across all of these agencies. And the focus of the first year was really building trust with many of these agencies to see the Climate Office as a benefit and not in service of taking on their work, but really hoping to amplify and coordinate on behalf of other agencies. So what do we do specifically? We have our own expertise and capacity within the Climate Action Office to lead on state policy around and programs and initiatives. We also have particular responsibilities from the Global Warming Solutions Act around tracking and assessing climate progress in the state and being able to communicate those findings with decision makers like yourselves, other agency leadership, and then the Vermont public. I'll speak specifically to how we're working to do that later on in the presentation. We've really valued and brought capacity to our office around communication and community engagement, understanding that The Global Warming Solutions Act, climate action more broadly, requires nothing more than a large transition and shift in the way we heat our homes, the way we move around the landscape, the way we think about building resilience. And as a result, we really focus on and strive to communicate and provide transparent and reliable information to Vermonters through staff capacity, not just when we have a plan or a policy, but at all times. So we're building trust and relationships with Vermonters. And then we're trying to really have meaningful conversations with Vermonters who have traditionally not been at the table. And we work really closely with the Environmental Justice Office, understanding that the Environmental Justice Office is working to develop community engagement plans. We feel like we're kind of the guinea pigs on testing practices that work on bringing frontline and impacted communities into the conversation around specific impacts around climate change and climate action. So just a little bit of a picture. We're a staff of 8. I lead the office. We have capacity around mitigation, the mitigation program, how we cut climate pollution. We're currently recruiting right now for a mitigation lead in our office, but we still have capacity through our mitigation and modeling coordinator, Brian Woods. We have, as I mentioned, specific capacity through community engagement and communications. We have 2 different resilience staff who I know joined you all earlier in the session to talk about the development of the resilience implementation strategy. So emphasis around both the built environment and the natural and working environment. We have a climate planning administrator, and then a specific position dedicated to modeling data and progress around climate change solutions. So I'm going to walk through some examples of work in the Climate Action Office and encourage you to pause and ask questions along the way if you'd like me to go in a little more further detail. So when we talk about reducing emissions, I think many of you are familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act has targets within it for the state of Vermont. The first of which was January 1st of this year to cut our climate pollution 26% below 2005 levels. And then a more challenging target for 2030 that requires us to cut our climate pollution 40% below 1990 levels. That equates to roughly in half from our highest level of emissions in 2005. Those targets require concerted effort, policy, programmatic work. And our office is just a small piece of that. Those policies are being implemented by our Agency of Transportation, our Public Service Department, and through legislation that you all act upon. But our office really sees ourselves as foundational in understanding the role of technical analysis to inform good policy development and good program development. So most recently, we worked really closely with the Treasurer's Office to develop a climate policy study that looked at the benefits and challenges and data information needs around joining a Cap and Invest program, looking at first how we would join the Western Climate Initiative. So the program originally stood up in California, but also participated by Quebec to our north, and then signaled to be joining by Washington State, who has their own program, as well as looked at New York's impending Cap and Invest program, which they have not stood up yet, but have been, we have a common interest agreement with them to work closely with them to understand timing and policy around that. So we completed the climate policy study that looked at, again, the benefits of the emissions reductions and the benefit of further emissions reductions through the revenue that would be received through a program like that. And then handed that technical study off to the treasurer for them to review and consider what more information was needed for them to actually be the ones to make the policy recommendation to the legislature, which we did in February of this year. And so that policy study is a example of the kind of studies that our office has led. We also led a study that looked at the clean heat standard amongst other policies to cut our emissions from our home heating sector. But those studies are the kinds, and we have base funding in our office to complete those studies on a fairly regular basis. So our budget includes $175,000 of base funding every year to sort of think about what pending policies or needs are out there around climate emissions. We have a business as usual model that our office runs. We regularly update that in service of the Climate Action Plan. We just presented that to the Climate Council last week. That looks at, with current policies in place, what our emissions are expected to do between now and 2030, and then even farther out to 2050. So understanding what further policies, programs need to be put in place to meet the targets. So that's the scenario planning to close the gap. We're in the process of updating those scenarios right now for the Climate Council as well, for the Climate Action Plan that's due to be adopted July 1st of this year. But we have a long-term contract to manage that work. And then we also have programmatic work within our office. Our office supported the rulemaking for the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. Those rules were the only rules proposed in the initial Climate Action Plan. And if you are familiar with the way the GWSA works, rules that are proposed in the Climate Action Plan are required by our agency to adopt within 1 year of the plan being adopted. It's actually an interesting compellment of the ANR to advance rules put forward in the CAP. And then finally, we also have some unique one-time funding programs in our office, a grant to VEIC, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, to look at how we replace high global warming potential refrigerants, largely used by grocery stores, to alternative solutions. And then we're also currently funding a program that the legislature funded through the American Recovery Act, ARPA funds, to CAP agencies, community action partnerships that have energy navigators within every CAP agency in the state, to work closely with financial coaches to be the bridge to support low-income Vermonters in accessing grants and funding to make home energy switches to low-emission heating sources and or weatherization programs. So we actually fund right now with one-time funds from our office those positions through the end of this fiscal year, and are contemplating how to keep them going into next fiscal year. I wanted to highlight that much of the progress, and I know your committee flagged for our Deputy Secretary yesterday some interest in federal funding and the role of federal funding that has played a part in reducing our emissions in Vermont. And wanted to highlight that one of the things I shared with your committee assistant, Annika, was a report that our agency has now produced, our office has produced for the last 2 years, which is through the Interagency Advisory Board. We've been putting together a climate spending document that analyzes new funding in the fiscal budget that we're in, to tell a compelling story about climate action being advanced through federal dollars, as well as other new dollars. It's certainly the bulk of that has been federal funds over the last 2 fiscal years, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and ARPA. But our office works to pull together all the new funding in the state budget to talk about where action is being advanced on climate solutions through new state spending. And I wanted to sort of create the picture that it has been very beneficial as a state to move climate action through these federal dollars, which we obviously knew were a temporary solution to long-term revenue needs around climate action. However, obviously the rollbacks and federal picture has changed faster than many of us expected. And we're now working to update the climate spending document to reflect where we already know funds have been pulled back, and we have a high, medium, or low confidence that they'll also get rolled back. So that's something we're in the process of updating across state government right now, and we'll make available on our website and share with the legislature through our contacts once it's been completed. But spending on climate action has steadily increased in recent years due to all this funding. In fiscal year 25 budget, we actually have more than almost $500 million, more than $500 million. I'm trying to figure out how to say that correctly. In large part due to federal investments. Again, much of that funding was coming to an end, but this is not, I just want to say it's not unique to only new funds that are being rolled back. there are critical programs and services in the climate space, like the Climate and Health Program, that has been around for decades, that are also facing zeroed out in the federal budget. So these are programs that Vermonters have come to rely on, not only in recent, but over decades, and often serve the most vulnerable in Vermont. And so we're thinking a lot about what that looks like through tools like the Resilience Implementation Strategy and other efforts to work closely on how we prioritize and think about these staff.
Can you give an example of those programs that affect the most vulnerable that you're worried about?
Yeah, so the Climate and Health Program is certainly one. They do a lot with heat vulnerability, disease vulnerability that is largely connected to climate. For instance, they had a BRIC grant, a grant through emergency management that looked at how to deploy and stand up resilience centers. So providing access in the face of high heat days to communities to get cooling centers. Because as many of you know, most Vermonters don't have air conditioning. And so our leading cause of climate hazard deaths is not flooding, it's actually heat vulnerability in Vermont. And so the Vermont Department of Health has been the front line working on solutions around heat vulnerability. Those staff are all facing termination in August, is the way I understand it. So those are real challenges. Many of the funds that in the chart that I shared with Annika that you have access to now are low income weatherization programs, fuel switching, all the EV incentive programs, EV charging, that's all facing being cut. And I just put this up with respect to the mitigation and emissions reductions work, because as you can see, the majority of this federal funding has been focused on cutting climate and cutting emissions. We have a large pot of money, which for resilience and adaptation, but that's in large part due to our hazard mitigation grant and flood recovery funds. So those are still there for now. But there are states such as North Carolina who are facing cutbacks to funding that they had already gotten or expected for Helene. So it's unclear what will happen if Vermont faces a flood this summer and next fall with support from the federal government. But there's a lot more detail in this report that I shared, so hopefully you'll use it. A couple other examples of work. I know that I will not go into great detail about this, but I'll use this as an opportunity to update you on the advancement of this work. Marion Woles and Evan Horn, who lead this on behalf of our office, were in here and spoke to you about the resilience implementation strategy. What I find really exciting about this opportunity is two things. One, I think it gets us to a level of actionability that is very different than the climate action plan. The climate action plan is striving to do further prioritization this time around, but the first climate action plan had 234 actions in a 4-year plan. And the Climate Council failed to further prioritize or speak to what the need was right out of the gate. This current climate action plan that we're working to adopt by July 1st, they've prioritized from those 250 actions to 53. And now they're working to actually communicate a top 10 between now and July 1st. And so I'm hopeful that the Climate Council will acknowledge that, yes, we need to take a full picture and full understanding of all that needs to be done, but there's just practical realities of what we can move on certain timelines. But the resilience implementation strategy did that from the onset and also worked very closely with the agencies and departments that would be the implementers. So the recommendations are not being developed by an independent council void of commitment and collaboration with the departments and programs that would put them forward. The recommendations in the RIS are being articulated in collaborations with the departments and programs who want to do this work and know there's a need. And so that's exciting. And then the climate action plan has also been somewhat void of cost. There is a requirement of costing and financing in the Global Warming Solutions Act, but it's often been a challenge to get at those financing solutions. And the RIS, the partnership with the Treasurer, has been really rich in thinking about how we put forward a total cost for resilience and adaptation development for programs, but also think about what are those sort of low-hanging fruit and opportunities that we can bring forward in the governor's budget or to the legislature next year to work in collaboration with moving forward with some high priority actions from it. So that's been very productive, and we're on track to put forward the full opportunities assessment with the priorities and the methodology for July 1st. And then the complete resilience implementation strategy will be presented to the legislature on September 15th, which is the date that is articulated in the Climate Superfund law, which is actually really the only place where the RIS shows up in law. It's the articulation of where the money from the Superfund, if we ever get our money from big oil, the money will go towards funding the resilience implementation strategy. So another pillar of the work of our office is around tracking progress. The Greenhouse Gas Inventory, which is the legal backstop to the Global Warming Solutions Act, and is something that Vermont had been producing since 2007, is now had moved, used to be done in the Department of Environmental Conservation. When the Climate Action Office was stood up, that work and that staff came to our office. We produce that on an annual basis. The most current greenhouse gas inventory is through 2021, and we're about to publish in June the 2022 greenhouse gas inventory. The inventory lags in large part because of national data sets that we rely on for the natural and working land sector. So you may have seen in the news that the secretary of our agency put out an acknowledgement that we likely missed our targets for the January 1st, 2025 deadline of the Global Warming Solutions Act. We can't say that for certain until we publish the greenhouse gas inventory, but the data for the two largest sectors, the transportation sector and the residential, commercial, industrial sector, that's Vermont data that we use from the tax department and the Department of Motor Vehicles. And that's data for the year of 2024 that we already have. So those are the two largest sectors and the sectors that are largely going to determine if we make or break the target. And we know those two sectors did not go where they need to go in order to meet the target. So we largely think that we missed the initial target for the GWSA, but the GWSA still requires us to produce the greenhouse gas inventory as the final determinant. And again, we're about 2.5 years behind calendar year, in large parts because of natural and working lands data, the ag sector in particular. But what you see on this table here is the inventory, and then the dots further out are the requirements of the GWSA. So for 2025, we need to be at 7.30, and then for 2030, should definitely have my glasses, 5.14. And so, as of 2021, we were at 8.28 million metric tons. In addition, the greenhouse gas inventory is relatively coarse data, meaning it's all fuel sales for transportation. It's all fuel sales for home heating. It's not a good indicator of the policy levers that are driving the change for our emissions. And so the Global Warming Solutions Act required the agency to stand up a measuring and assessing progress tool, which looks at how we track the policy levers and the tools and the metrics associated with what we expect would yield emissions reductions in the inventory. So it's intended to be a dashboard-like tool that tracks both the policies and measures for emissions reductions, but it also goes further and looks at how we track and speak to advancing resilience and adaptation. It also speaks about equity and engagement. And we have just completed phase 1 of that tool, which looks at the scale and scoping of what are the metrics that we want to be tracking, where does the data live, and then what is a recommendation for the infrastructure or the tool we need to build in order to do this. And I'm glad to say that we have that recommendation. We have the money in our budget to build that tool next year. And new staff actually associated with managing both of these two components, and really feel like the long-term trust and relationship around how we speak to climate action will be communicated through better data and better plain language about that data for Vermonters to use. So the final component of the work of our office, as I mentioned at the beginning, has really been focused around communications and climate engagement. We're really fortunate in our office, as many departments and agencies don't have capacity to have dedicated communications staff. We have a dedicated communications and community engagement coordinator in our office. She works really closely to view and vet press releases and communications materials across the whole agency of natural resources, and to support other agencies in thinking about talking points and messaging around climate action. We've been working closely with the secretary to communicate what her priorities are around how we speak to climate action. When the Lakes and Ponds Division of the Department of Environmental Conservation puts out a press release about algal blooms, like how we can work in a talking point about why those are occurring more frequently and make a connection to climate change, is really what we're striving to do through that review and communication. How we align our messaging around burning wood, when our Forest and Parks Department really communicates that as a climate solution and strategy, and then our Department of Environmental Conservation, air quality, talks about the challenges around the emissions for wood. How do we speak and on both hands and communicate that properly for Vermonters? Our office is striving to do that. And then, as I mentioned, we're really trying to do engagement, not just in the time of a plan or a new policy, but meeting Vermonters where they are. And so we have both our staff capacity, and then we have a contract that helps support tracking and monitoring community events across the state. So we have a community engagement report that we produce quarterly that speaks to all the events we're going to around the state, showing up, talking about climate action in state government, bringing forward materials, and then trying to bring forward voices who have traditionally not been at the table, so that we can build trust, so that when we hold our 9 public meetings that we just did in April for the climate action plan and travel around the state, we have people who are wanting to come to those meetings and talk with us about a climate action plan, because they feel like their voices will be heard, solutions will be recognized, and they'll be worked into the plan. And I say that in the 4 years when we did the outreach for the first climate action plan and the outreach we just did, it was a monumental shift to the people who showed up, the number of people. We had people who required translation services at broad-based public engagement. That's a real shift. We've been having focus meetings and focus events where we've been using cultural advisors to bring in non-English speaking Vermonters to talk with us. But we've had those, like, Somali events or Spanish speaking events. Now those folks are wanting to engage with us at broad-based events and figure out how to fold their voices into meetings with all Vermonters. And that's been really a positive development in the kind of engagement that we do and the voices who are coming to the table to talk to us about climate action. And finally, I'll just say, a key role of the office is clearly to provide administrative support for the Climate Council. The Climate Council is an independent body, but our office is required to both staff and support the public meeting components of the Climate Council. We have contractual services that specifically support the Global Warming Solutions Act. So whether it's technical services that inform the plan, or whether it's an ongoing contract for facilitation services to rein in all the different viewpoints and help reach consensus when we're developing a plan. That's something that we built into our base budget of our office, so that we can continue to provide that support and work closely with the Climate Council to support the development of the climate plans that are required to be updated and revised every 4 years. And as I've mentioned previously, this update is due in just another month and a half. So hopefully we will make it at the same time as the resilience implementation strategy. I'll say we're all looking forward to July 2nd. But those are the core components of our office. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions or anything I might have missed in my overview.
Members have any questions? Representative
Yes,
Austin.
does every state have a quota in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions? Because I think what I hear from my constituents is Vermont's so small. You know, why are we spending time and money on this when we should be doing something, you know, at a higher priority?
Yeah, around, so I'll speak first to, other state commitments. So the states I know the most about, which I would expect be the only states that would have, commitments. Vermont, Governor Scott, was one of the initial governors who signed on to the US Climate Alliance. When the Trump 1 administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, a Governors Alliance formed, that looked at state leadership to meet the commitments of the Paris Climate Agreement. That membership has ebbed and flowed depending on governors, over the last 8 years. It's 8 years old, the alliance. I was just with them and I represent the governor at those meetings. Those, there are currently 24 alliance states, so 24 states that are a member of that. And not all of those states have emissions reductions requirements. About half of them do. And then from that half, only a smaller number, and I'd be happy, rather than to get it wrong, follow up with the exact data to Annika on an email this afternoon. Only a handful, I would say, actually have them in statute. So I obviously Massachusetts and New York and Maine and Vermont are in the Northeast, but like even Connecticut does not have them as statutory requirements. And obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but New Hampshire does not either. So many of the Northeast states do have climate commitments, but I do think, you know, the question of balancing funding and resources is a good question. Understanding that our emissions are about 8 million metric tons annually, and New York's are about 400 million metric tons. And they are not on track to meet their emissions reductions requirement in any way, New York right now, and are challenged in the same way. And as federal funding dries up for resilience and adaptation, and there are real constraints, it's a challenge. I mean, we have a moral and a statutory responsibility, as councilor members would say, and I completely agree, to cut our emissions. But even if we cut our emissions to zero, we are not going to stop the impacts of climate change in our state. And therefore, we need to be balancing with how we invest in resilience and adaptation and nature-based solutions front mind for that.
So if they don't have, you sort of said if they only a handful have goals in statute or reduction requirements. Are they by rule? Are they, what else are states?
A lot of executive orders.
Yeah.
So North Carolina, Wisconsin, those are two states that are member states. They have Democratic governors who have signed EOs that make commitments, but they have Republican legislatures that will not pass emissions reductions in statute. So, you know, those executive orders are obviously not as binding as ours, understanding that with the governor change, executive orders can change. I will say what's and perhaps even more compelling in states that are purple is renewable energy requirements. So North Carolina is a good example where you have a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, but they have very strong commitments to clean energy, largely in part because they see it as economic development and economic growth for their state. And so they can get there through that, which also helps them cut their emissions. And then New York State has both. New York State has extremely strict emissions reductions that are in law like ours, but then they also have clean energy requirements that are very ambitious as well.
Senator North.
Thank you, Chair. Your presentation, I liked your statement there at the end. Even if we reduce our emissions to zero, we're not going to stop climate change effects here in our state. Thus, focusing on climate resilience is key. So, thank you for that. So given the fact that in FY25, as you said, we spent over $500 million, it's a lot of money. What durable improvements toward climate resilience do we have that we point to?
Yeah, I mean, our state is a leader in resilience, and I'd like to point to our Vermont emergency management and the way we do hazard mitigation. The example that comes to mind was when when we were spared the worst of the flooding in the December and January events of the end of 2023 into 24. Maine flooded coastal. At first, they had the inland flooding in Maine, and then they had significant coastal flooding. And Secretary Moore and I joined the Maine Climate Council to meet with them about what our state work has done around resilience. Thanks to many of the components of the work that we do for wetland restoration in our state, for the likes of the passage of things like the Flood Safety Act. But since Irene, just the interagency coordination, the work on state hazard mitigation, that is not something other states do yet. I mean, Vermont Emergency Management is in Maine, for instance, they have a wonderful VEM director in Maine, but it's very much a public safety. They have not focused on the upfront community resilience and work that our emergency management department has. That said, a lot of that work in our Vermont Emergency Management is either with federal dollars or through one-time funding from our legislature. And I can say one of the actions in the resilience implementation strategy that we're talking a lot about and contemplating as a priority is how we frame the needs of long-term funding for the Flood Community Resilience Fund in the state, because those are the kinds of programs that make real investments in our communities in thinking about how they weather the climate impacts that they're going to face and how they build resilience. Our office, another really exciting project that our office that I didn't highlight is leading is after the deployment of the initial climate action plan, many municipalities reached out to us and we were doing lots of roadshow about climate action plan, and towns were like, well, how can we use this to develop our own plans? And the state climate action plan is really not scalable to municipalities. It's really a state plan, but we're developing a municipal climate planning framework right now that first and foremost looks at how to derive climate action at the municipal level, not how do you develop another plan that is a process and gets put on a shelf. But when communities want to deploy climate action to build and really focused on resilience and adaptation, how do we support that? And so we have an exceptional contractor, Seiler Consulting, actually out of Maine, working with us on a 2-year project to put that forward. And and we have a municipal advisory group working closely with communities of different scale and capacity to think about what that can look like. But hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you so much for sharing your great work with us.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone.
So we have one more topic before we break for lunch, which is having our legislative council back in to talk about the 3-acre H481.
Enjoy the weather. Thank you so much.
So this is Michael Grady with Legislative Council. You should all have the side-by-side of H481 as passed by the House and as proposed by the Senate. It is on your website. I can just take you through the differences.
Great.
So on page 1 of the side-by-side in the stormwater section, 10 VSA 1264, the Senate Natural Resources Committee heard that not all property owners subject to a 3-acre permit were receiving notice of application or its application to them. So they wanted to add that the secretary should provide notice to all owners of property subject to the permit required under this subdivision, which is the 3-acre permit.
Okay.
You can go to the second page of the side-by-side. This is in that language that passed the House, that the municipality that assumes full legal responsibility for a stormwater system may assess fees on users of the stormwater system, provided that the majority of the owner is subject to the fee consent. You use the term impact fees, and this is on me. Impact fee is something of a term of art in both municipal law and federal takings law, and the league came in and wanted it changed to assessment fee. And so that is what was done in the Senate Natural Resources Committee.
Sounds like you agree that it's more clear.
Yes, yes. It avoids some legal arguments about how impact fees need to be used. So that allows you to go to page 8. In the municipal stormwater implementation program, there was a floor amendment treated as friendly by Senate Natural Resources that would allow funding from the municipal implementation program to be used for design or engineering services necessary for the formation of a municipal stormwater utility. But before utilities even start, they kind of have to identify their limits and their design for purposes of adoption of municipal ordinance, and this would allow for that.
Is this just a typo I'm seeing? Is you got H481 is passed and then S124?
That's just a typo, I'm sorry.
Just making sure.
Big question. Yeah,
My fault.
Can I just ask one thing about the funding?
May.
So do we need a fiscal note with this? I mean, where's the funding coming from?
There's already a fiscal note.
Oh, okay.
Already.
For this addition?
Yep.
Okay.
I received this.
You can go to page 10. Partly related to a conversation you had, the Senate Appropriations Committee had a discussion about whether or not the clean water surcharge on the property transfer tax should be scheduled for repeal, should be amended at some future date, should maybe potentially no longer be necessary. Because all those questions are unknown, what they did is instead was as part of the clean water investment report every 4 years, there'll be a report from the Secretary of Administration regarding the revenue generated by the surcharge, whether it remains necessary, and whether it should be continued, adjusted, or repealed at a specified date. The bottom of that page in the recommended appropriations, there is a new subdivision added that there will be additional priority points when awarding financing under the Municipal Stormwater Implementation Program and Developed Lands Implementation Program when residential housing used as primary residences are located on the relevant properties. So 3-acre permits, HOA, orphan subdivisions, the subdivisions with the water or other parcel-based issues, they would have some priority, not full priority, not the priority. They would get additional priority points when applying for those programs. On page 12, the Senate added a stormwater management public resource guide. This is basically to inform persons subject to stormwater operating permits with information and resources related to complying with and paying for permitting requirements. It's going to summarize permitting requirements and why permits are required, recommend available, practical, cost-effective measures to address them, including HOA issues, lack of available property, runoff from other property. They'll recommend resources where funding for compliance with permitting requirements may be accessed or applied for, including financial assistance at A&R. They're going to provide a contact at A&R that can assist persons subject to stormwater permitting by answering questions, providing referrals to creative or alternative solutions for permit compliance, and available financial resources. And then another friendly amendment for provide a model bylaw or ordinance for the formation of a municipal stormwater utility.
The agency weigh in on this?
They were generally okay with that amendment. They
This whole guide?
Yes, the whole guide, yes. Yes. On page 13, section 10, you might remember that you included in the municipal stormwater implementation program, when the Clean Water Fund makes its recommendations, including at least $1 million annually for cost of complying with permitting requirements under the 3-acre permit, 1264C7. They wanted that to sunset in October of 2032, and that's what section 10 does.
It does? Looks like it strikes the $1 million and
Right, it strikes the requirement that the Clean Water Board recommend at least $1 million for the municipal stormwater implementation program when it annually makes its recommendations. And so it sunsets that in 2032.
in a different location.
Yeah, the sunset's in the effective date.
Okay.
What is it that's getting sunsetted? I'm sorry.
The requirement that at least 1 million annually for costs complying with permitting requirements be recommended by the Clean Water Fund annually.
So section 10 has an implementation date of that later date.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Next change is section 15. In the study committee, they wanted it to be about stormwater management and creation of regional stormwater utility districts. Next change is on page 16 in the membership of the study committee. They wanted a representative of an RPC and a representative of a not quite small, not quite large, medium, with a designated downtown area served by water and sewer infrastructure that is not subject to an MS4 permit. And then on page 17, there was just a language choice about consider prior revenue raising instead of consideration of. And then down at the bottom of that page, as part of the study committee, they're going to recommend whether and how a regional utility can improve the management of parcel-based issues in a more cost-effective and equitable manner, such as how a regional utility could address regulation of stormwater systems lacking an HOA or other accountable entity, or how a regional utility can improve management of upstream properties that drain into stormwater systems subject to permitting. And they are also going to recommend whether stormwater permitting for municipalities or others could be streamlined to improve the application process, permit renewal fee requirement. I think you heard from the league on that, or maybe representatives of the Green Mountain Water Association about streamlining. So the study committee is going to look at that issue as well.
It's definitely consistent with what we're talking
Far. So, but the study committee is now 9 people.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And then in the effective dates on page 19, this is where that future change to the Clean Water Fund priorities, where that at least $1 million to the municipal implementation grant program would take effect October 1, 2032.
This thing get put into statute. It seems so odd
What's that?
to delete an entire section statute in the future. How does that end up in the Green Book?
So because it's actually a subsection of a section, you'll be reading through the green books and there will then be a parenthetical that says subdivision C is effective until October 1, 2032. See below subdivision C effective October 2032. And then you go down another parenthetical, see below effective October 1, 2032, and it shows you what's effective 2032.
Okay. And can we just go back to page 8? Because I'm not sure I caught that actual content of that change.
So the assistance for designer engineering for stormwater utilities. So last year in Senate Gov Ops, and then again this year, there was testimony that some municipalities that have interest in reforming stormwater utilities were either unaware of assistance from ANR or need assistance in general in order to acquire the services necessary to start the formation of a stormwater utility. And specifically Senator Harrison, who has been very keen on trying to form stormwater utilities in certain parts of the state, specifically the Southeast, is looking for assistance for those municipalities that might not have, say, the staff such as like a South Burlington or an Essex to hire people to help do the pre-design of a utility. Like, do you like you have to identify the impervious surface that's going to be subject to it. You have to define the boundaries of what the utility is going to be. That requires basically LiDAR or other engineering. And then you design criteria for it. And so that's basically what they're looking for as consultants to help with that pre-formation stormwater utility requirement.
Representative
So is
Austin.
this all coming out of this $1 million? Like,
No,
so where is this coming from? The funding for this?
remember you put $5 million into this program
So it would come out of that.
next year and
Okay.
then $1 million annually after that. And you could recommend as much as you wanted for this program.
So, members, these proposed changes, H481, are on the notice calendar today. Be taken up tomorrow. And so we, as a group, need to decide what we want to do. We can do a straw poll to agree. We could propose a further amendment. Or if we were really worked up, we could ask for a committee of conference. We don't need to make a decision today. We have a vote scheduled for tomorrow on how we want to proceed, but that's where we're at with 481. Representative Pritchard.
Page 12B, just explain that to me. Lack of available property to implement stormwater management, including whether and how a person subject to stormwater permits can implement an offsite. So it sounds like you have a problem you need to fix, but you can't fix it. So you're going to fix somebody else's that should be fixing it. I mean, what does that mean?
So under the stormwater management manual, you do an engineering feasibility analysis and what you can do on your property, or you can on neighboring property as well. You can look to see if you could maybe get an easement on neighboring property, etc. But if you can't do anything because site constraints, for example, there's a subdivision in South Burlington that's one boundary is I-89, one boundary is a creek, and the other boundary is the parking lot for the University Mall. And what they could do is very, very limited. So they really almost can do nothing in that property. And so like, how do you address that? How would a utility basically be able to come in, maybe assume responsibility for that permitting, and then find projects within that same watershed that could be completed to meet the reduction requirements that the subdivision couldn't do on its own parcel limit.
Based on what their remediation would have cost if they could have done it, or?
Well, it's not about the cost, it's about the performance measure. And an offset is not supposed to be on a project that is already regulatorily required to meet the stormwater. You have to go find something that's not regulatorily required to be done anyway. It's like, maybe it's replacements of coke, maybe it's stream bank stabilization, maybe it's, forestation, maybe, things that will meet the management goal that you couldn't do on your own property, but you're doing in that same watershed to meet the goal. Already something that's in the management manual.
It's already in. Why is it underlined?
So this is just the utility, the stormwater management resource guide, like, how do you do it? Like, this is gonna be available to the public, like, if you have this issue, how do you do it? Right? How do you manage that? What are your options? Because that's what the committee heard, that especially from the residential owner subject to the 3 acre, that they don't know what to do. They don't know what their alternatives are. What should they be doing? What could they be doing? How do they deal with the runoff from the uphill property, and who do they talk to at A&R about what solutions could be available? And this is about collecting all of that information in one resource. It's going to be free of charge to the public to provide that type of information.
Right. Thank you, Michael, for walking us through this. Well, tomorrow, well, actually, we'll discuss it. We can discuss it after the floor and then have a plan for tomorrow.